And my maybe first beginning was in New Orleans, where I grew up, where there's a relentless datum there and yet an unstable ground. And I think the combination of those two surfaces as the formative surface of my childhood still informs how I think and work today. And then I suppose there's the kind of educational beginnings. Undergraduate at University of Virginia, where I was an English and architecture major. English first, then architecture. Never wanted to do English again. And then somehow those things resolved themselves after graduate school. So I think life really is a book with many, many chapters. And so the chapter of my graduate education was probably a new start again, after having been at the University of Virginia, which in the 80s, which was very postmodern and very Beaux-Arts still, then to 10 years later, after working in a corporate office, to start again at Columbia. In the year I started was the first year of the Paperless Studios. So it was an amazing time to be at Columbia, and about as far away from my undergraduate education as you could possibly get. So there were many sort of formative moments in my graduate education. I had an enormous and varied and really influential set of teachers there, everyone from kind of Frampton to Michael Hayes, who came for seminars for Stan Allen, studio critics like Keller Easterling, Bill McDonald, and I think the kind of diversity of influences that I've had and have sort of restarted me over and over again. And I do feel like I'm still, the Venice Biennale has been a new beginning. Working with Anna and Eva, Anna Miliaki and Eva Frank, has been a whole new beginning for me as well. And yeah, I see many more in the future. It's funny how also some of those beginnings come back and re-inform things that you do. The US Pavilion now, looking at a kind of cross-section of practices, including corporate ones and more avant-garde ones. Something that I was really familiar with from my past, or the fact that I was an English major and at some point never wanted to write again, now comes back. So there's new beginnings, but then there's also returns, and there's these things that sort of bubble up and help, I think, remake or have helped remake who I am. And who knows what the next one will be, but I'm looking forward to it. I would say there's, in terms of decisive moments in the trajectory of Praxis, it's really been an evolution, and I think that's the way we set it out to be. We imagined it when we started. Maybe that's the decisive moment, is just the start of it. But when we started it, we believed that we would set the journal up with this theme-based strategy in order to allow the journal to have a consistent presence for many years, but that it could be agile, that it could adapt, that it could transform and change. So, the first issue was pretty, the sort of most talked about issue in architectural discourse at the time was the relationship of theory and practice, and there was a huge amount of angst about the academy and the profession. And so our first issue dealt with architecture in the university, and that manifested itself through both buildings and through writings on buildings and through architectural buildings that were done on university campuses. And so it was a kind of quite literal, I would say, way of addressing that topic. And the next few were fairly straight up, although we always took a slightly different turn on things. So, there was an issue on detail, an issue on housing. But then, for example, after we felt a little more confident in what we were doing, we took on issues like capitalism. At some point, we took on the issue of surface, but those issues also came out of, quite frankly, just an interest in and a kind of sensing of what was happening in the field. So the issue of surface it came out from a bit of a crisis with Praxis. We were sort of thinking, okay, we've done some typological issues, we've done some more theoretical issues, what do we do next? And so we asked everyone to bring in like 5 of the most interesting things you've seen, and we pinned them all up on the wall. And we started looking at them and we were asking, what is interesting about these things? And what began to emerge from what we saw on the wall was this kind of really persistent interest and obsession with the way surface might be manipulated. More recently, the issue that was just published on narrative, again, we just began finding practices like Jimenez's of architects who are working through telling stories, that becomes the sort of driver, and it's very different than I would say it was in the 80s. It's not a kind of revert to paper architecture because there's nothing else available or because that's a way of working through an issue, but it really is a means, it seemed to us, of inspiring design as a design practice in itself, but also to inspire a physical design like we're seeing here in this pavilion. You know what's funny is maybe beginnings, because you don't know what's going to come from a beginning, at the time, they don't seem significant, right? And so the idea of talking about beginnings is a strange one, because at the moment of the beginning, there's no registration of significance. Right. And so the beginning of Praxis, really, literally the beginning of Praxis, maybe it had 2 beginnings. One was Amanda Reeser and I were in the same studio together first semester, first year at Columbia, and by virtue of alphabetical order, she being an R and me being an S, we were seated next to each other, and by virtue of random housing lottery, we happened to live across the street from each other on 111th Street, and we were walking home from studio together and lamenting the quality of architectural publications this first semester, first year, and saying, and coming, being fairly naive first year students and saying, why is there assemblage and why is there architectural record or architecture magazine, and there's a kind of trade publication and academic publication, and can't we be smart about buildings? Can't we put those 2 things together? That was maybe the very beginning of it. It's just a real, late night charrette delusional discussion. And, it was like, maybe we should start our own magazine. Nothing. And then, 3 years later, as we were graduating, we remained friends. We ended up working in a studio together in a group project in our last studio. And again, walking back to our apartments, we said, we talked about doing this. If we're ever going to do it, now's the time. And so, when many of our friends went and started offices right out of school or went and worked for other offices, somehow it seemed easier. Neither of us were going to be satisfied with just going and doing our jobs, whatever that was going to be. We both wanted some other creative outlet. And for us at the time, it seemed easier to start a journal than it seemed to start an office, which is, if we know what we knew now, maybe we wouldn't have made that decision. But we did, and so there was that kind of decisive moment then too, and then the decisive moment to apply for some grants, and the decisive moment when we got that first grant and looked at the letter, and our thinking really, it was, oh shit, we have to do this now. They've given us the money. So there's like many small decisive moments that don't seem so significant, but actually amount to a lot. Or the beginning of the U.S. Pavilion this year, this particular project. I had always thought that I'd like to apply to do the U.S. Pavilion, and apply as Praxis, as an institution. I mean, typically the U.S. Pavilion is curated by a collaboration between an institution and a journal. Praxis happened to be launched at Storefront, and it seemed like a good match, so picked up the phone and called Ava and said, "Hey, Ava, are you thinking about doing, applying?" And she said, "Yeah, I'm thinking about applying." And it was like, and I said, "Wow, maybe we can do this together." And we started talking about ideas. And so, that's the beginning of something that's had a full chapter now. And who knows where that chapter will go from here. But it was such an insignificant moment. And yet it's become this. So, but you were talking about the framing as an intellectual project. And I do think that is maybe something that's been consistent through all of these chapters, is an interest in thinking about architecture not as form per se, but thinking about it in relationship to the things that produce it or drive it. For me, that's an interest. So it's looking at the things that might frame a contemporary moment, or might frame a particular architect's work, or how you understand things in terms of their relations to other things. And I think that is probably the consistent thing in the chapters that have started that ties the book together.